Hello, how's everyone doing today? I'm here with special guests, Walter Block. Walter Block is a professor from Loyola University, Austrian economist, and he will be debating anarchy. And I'm also here with special guest Jan Helfeld, who many of you know interviews people using the Socratic method, and he will argue for a limited government. Um, how's everyone doing today? We'll start with Walter. Ready?
Okay.
Okay, my turn?
Yeah.
Yes.
First, I wanted to say that Jan is one of the most magnificent interviewers I've ever seen. Everyone must watch his interview of Nancy Pelosi on the minimum wage. It was just the most magnificent thing. He got her so messed up that she was going to call the cops on him for interviewing her too harshly. I mean, it was just magnificent. Second point I wanted to make is that I think, in a sense, this debate is premature. Ideally, what we should do is wait until we get the government down to about 5%, assuming that that's what Jan wants, get it to be 5% or so, or whatever, of whatever it is now, and then we argue, should we go any further? Right now, I feel much more a partner of Jan than an opponent of his, because we both want the government to be reduced by, say, 95%, and we're just arguing about the last 5% or the last 1% or whatever it is. Also, Jan is a limited government libertarian, and I think that limited government libertarians are libertarians, and I think that most people who call themselves libertarians are not anarchists, but rather are limited government libertarians. So I'm sort of a big tent guy on this. I see Jan as a fellow libertarian. And not only that, but I go along with Murray Rothbard, who said he'd rather have and I'll find out if Jan qualifies for this, he'd rather have a minarchist or a minimal government statist who hates the state, especially when the state exceeds what the proper level is, rather than an anarchist like David Friedman, who is an anarchist but doesn't really hate the state. So we'll see if Jan hates the state or not, but certainly I join Murray Rothbard in welcoming minarchists who hate the state more than anarchists who don't. Then there's also this thing, the Dallas Accord in the among the Libertarian Party, where they sort of agreed, let's not debate these things. Let's reduce the state as much as we can, and then when we get down to 5%, then we can have these debates. But since we're having the debate, I might as well do the best I can, because I think that anarchism is the proper view, and minarchism is how shall I say it, is libertarian, and I respect the view, but I don't think it's quite right. It's not as good as the anarchist position. So let me make the anarchist position. As a libertarian, I adhere to the non-aggression principle. The idea is, keep your mitts to yourself. Don't grab other people or their property without their permission. And the problem with the state, from a deontological point of view, I'll first divide my remarks into deontology or rights and then utilitarianism. So from a deontological point of view, the state is incompatible with libertarianism if libertarianism is properly understood, because the state necessarily violates rights. The government taxes people, and taxes are compulsory. We didn't join this club. What is it? I think it's Schumpeter who said, and here's a direct quote, "The theory which construes taxes on the analogy of club dues or the purchase of the services of a doctor only proves how far removed this part of the social science is from scientific habits of mind." So government is not a club. We didn't join the club. I didn't sign anything. I didn't sign any contract. And they come up to me on April 15th, or actually all through the year, and they take money from me against my will. That's, that's coercion. That's a violation of the non-aggression principle. And also, if I want to have a competing state and have them provide services or protection or whatever, and not pay them their taxes, the government is going to very strongly object to that. So the first problem from the deontological point of view is that the government necessarily violates rights. The second point I would say is we should have secession. Another aspect of libertarianism, in addition to the non-aggression principle, is free association. We should only associate with people freely. We should not be forced to associate with people we don't want to associate with. That's the problem with rape and slavery. The rape victim and the slave don't want to associate with the rapist or the master. They want to disassociate. So I think secession is always justified. And if Louisiana wants to secede from the U.S., that's justified. And if New Orleans, I'm picking where I live, wants to secede from Louisiana, that should be justified. And if the Garden District, where I live, wants to secede from New Orleans, fine. How far should this go? It should go right down to the individual level. Well, sometimes people call Mises an anarchist, although I don't think he really was, because he believed in secession down to the individual level. Well, if you have secession down to the individual level, then in these here United States, instead of one country and, 330 million people, we have 330 million governments. Each person is their own government, and that would be roughly anarchism. The third point I would make on deontology or rights-based understanding in favor of anarchism is that there's now anarchy between states. The United States is in a state of anarchy with regard to Australia, in the sense that there's no government over the United States and Australia. Cuba and Chile are in a state of anarchy. France and Fiji are in a state of anarchy. Every country is in a state of anarchy with every other country. And I like this. I think it's much better than world government. And my logical point here is that if you really oppose anarchy, then you can't, how shall I say, accept anarchy between states. You have to say, well, we should have world government. But world government has got a lot of problems. I mean, if we had a world government, then if it was democratic, China and India between them would outvote everybody else on pretty much everything. And I think that this is a sort of a logical gotcha kind of point against the non-anarchists, that their position logically implies world government, and I don't think that they will accept that, although we'll have to see from Jan whether he does accept it or not. Okay, so much for deontology or rights-based or logic. I think that these 3 points, that it violates the non-aggression principle, secession, and anarchy between countries, is a very powerful indictment of the limited government philosophy. Now let me talk a little bit about utilitarianism or pragmatism. The point might be, okay, Bloch, you're right, anarchism is great, it's logical, it's compatible with libertarianism, but you might have murder in the streets. You might have gangs fighting each other. You might have, if we didn't have a government like the United States, we might have, what is it, that country, Somalia, where they have anarchy, and Ukraine or other places like that. Now, one problem is, people sometimes use anarchy as a what do you call it, as a synonym for chaos, and obviously it's not that. The Rothbard and even the David Friedman view of anarchy is anything the opposite of chaos. Rather, what we have chaos is now with governments. There are people, Rummel is one of them, Conquest is another. There's a guy, Courtois, and what these people do is they ask, how many people did governments murder in the last century, in the 20th century? Again, what I'm now talking about is pragmatism or utilitarianism. Namely, anarchism might be right, but maybe more people will be killed under anarchism than under government, because gangs will start fighting each other. And what they say is, if I understand it correctly, that something like 170 or 190 million people were killed by governments, and not in wars, apart from wars, just killed their own people. And it's hard to see how the Blood and the Crips or gangs like that could get anywhere near killing that many people. Government has got a lot of good publicity, good public relations, and these gangs don't, so people naturally don't adhere to these gangs as much as they adhere to the government. And also, government creates a lot of murders beside killing people directly, for example, the war on drugs, although I can't imagine Jan as a libertarian would favor the war on drugs, but still, governments have the war on drugs, and that kills a lot of people. And also, my own research about privatizing highways. Governments in the United States kill about 35 or 40,000 people every year in highway fatalities, which I attribute to government. And Rommel, Courtois, and Conquest don't count this. So if you were to add that to the number of people that governments kill an awful lot of people, and it's hard to see how gangs would arise. And I sort of regard gangs as sort of governmental-ish, because the essence of government is the violation of the non-aggression principle. So when a mugger or a rapist attacks someone, the way I see it is that they are acting governmentally, because the essence of government is violation of the non-aggression principle, and what they're doing is acting governmentally because they're violating the non-aggression principle. So I think that that's pretty much my opening statement, that both on deontology, where I think it's cut and dried, there's just no room for the minarchist view. Anarchism is correct and logical. In utilitarianism or pragmatism, I admit it's a horse race. It's an empirical issue as to under which conditions would more people be killed, which I take as a proxy variable for misery and unhappiness. And I think it's an empirical issue, but I think that the evidence that we have, and evidence is now relevant, is on the side of anarchism. I'm out of time now?
You have like 30 seconds, like pretty much, yeah.
Okay, well, I've pretty much finished. I thought you were interrupting me, so I was getting ready to stop in.
It's my turn?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to say that I would like to extend the same invitation as a partner against statism to all the anarchists, as Walter did to me. I hate the abuses of the state, and I resent the infringements of my rights by the state. So in that sense, I agree with him. I do not think that the state is incompatible with libertarianism, and I think that in order to understand why it isn't incompatible, you have to understand the context of the formation of the state and the formation of a limited government. And I'm going to get into that more thoroughly. I think the solution for the people that disagree with limited government and don't want to have any government at all, and no law that applies to everyone necessarily, is secession. And I do agree that that in a limited government, people would have a procedure in order for those individuals that wanted to secede to buy up land and territory in another part of the United States. They don't have to get out of the United States, and they can establish their own country or society or anarchist social organization. I'm all in favor of them being able to do that, and I think that would be great because they could have the anarchist experiment there. It would have to be a certain amount of people. I disagree with Walter where one person can be a government. I think that differences in quantity amount to differences in quality, and that's one good example where one individual cannot be a government. So I'm in favor of the anarchist rights to experiment, but this is the problem. The anarchist position and the limited government or any government position is incompatible. Either in a given territory you have a government that enacts laws and enforces them, and they're supposed to apply to everyone, or you don't. If your view is that you don't, and you live in a society where 99% of the people think that it is necessary for their individual rights to be protected, to have a government that can enact laws to protect their rights and make sure that they can live a good life, then there are only one solution, which is to secede. When people disagree at such a fundamental level, at a radical level like this, they cannot be integrated into the same society. They can't all live together because they have too big a difference. And once you understand that the people that are in a limited government have delegated the power to the government to protect their individual rights, and therefore agree and want the government to protect their rights, and therefore agree to pay for that service, then you realize that their rights are not being violated. They are not being abused because they think that this is essential for their welfare and self-interest. So, in fact, they think that if there wasn't a government and there weren't any laws that were applicable to everyone, that would put their life, liberty, and property in peril. So there's a very fundamental difference of opinion about where the protection of your rights resides. And the solution is, as I said before, I think that it is true maybe that anarchy is not chaos because the people organize in a certain way, but it is lawlessness in the sense that there isn't a law of the land, there is no national law, and when a law is enacted, it's not like with a limited government that it's supposed to apply to everyone. That's a principle that the people that believe in government believe in, but the anarchists don't. They think that you should only abide by the laws that you yourself agree to, and at any time you don't agree, you can say, I secede. And those two positions are not integratable, and I think Walter also agrees they're not integratable. So the issue really ultimately is which of the positions protects the individual rights of the citizens to a greater degree, and which is more likely to protect the rights of the citizens. Now, in my view, in order to live well, that is, in order to have the optimal satisfaction of the natural needs of a human being, and thus the greatest possibility of a happy life, you need to have your rights protected. So we agree on that, I think. And you need to have your right to life, liberty, and property, as well as bodily integrity, protected. Now, I think that that's what this debate is all about. It's about which of these two views, whether no government or limited government, offers a greater protection. I agree with Jefferson, as he said in the Declaration of Independence, that to secure these rights, governments are constituted. That implies that we do need a government, but it's got to be limited to protecting the individual rights of the citizens. So, in my view, in order to have the optimal protection of your individual rights, you need a constitutional republic that is dedicated to protecting the individual rights of the citizens. So, let's examine some of the consequences of anarchism. One of the big consequences is that it creates a proliferation of crime. There is an exponential increase in crime, and I like to explain why. When there is a government, well, first of all, let's start with the fact that there are always going to be some individuals that choose predation in any society. And when there is a government that has a monopoly on major force, they have no chance to oppose the government directly. So there's no reason for them to get military hardware, because it doesn't help them extort or rob any more victims. However, if the government is removed, then all of a sudden, all the weak individuals and weak security agencies that existed to that moment, these people are now potential victims because they no longer have the protection of this government, of the police, to protect them. But worse, there is an incentive to buy military hardware. These criminals and predators now have an incentive to buy military hardware like drones and rockets and tanks, etc. They didn't have the incentive before, but now they do have the incentive, because the more military hardware they have, the greater the pool of potential victims there is. And so, this way, we're going back and forth. I'm supposed to be on camera. When they have this incentive, they will go ahead and try to get more hardware so that they can increase the pool of victims, and that creates a mini arms race where the other people that are potential victims, then they have to arm themselves. The security agencies have to arm themselves, and this is like a mini arms race. And then when there's a miscalculation between one group and the other group, and they think that they can overpower them, and they can't, there's a war. And that's why I say that anarchism leads to gang warfare. That's one of the reasons, because there's this escalation and benefit of having military hardware.
1 minute.
And this, what?
1 minute.
Okay. And this, as I was saying before, it made me lose my train of thought. Let me give you an example. When these criminals have this military hardware, they send you a note saying, you, sir, send us X amount of money, or we have this drone and we're going to bomb your house. And if you don't believe it, look out the window so you can see your neighbor's house and see what happened to him. Now, individuals probably do not have enough wherewithal to protect themselves against that threat and will have to pay that extortion. Or they can have more hardware where they can shoot a rocket from a tank or from an attack helicopter or whatever. And so everybody has to arm up, and those people that are weaker are going to be victimized. So you have to have an answer to what are you going to do when you get that extortion note. If you want to see what the consequence is of not having the police there, what happens when the long arm of the law doesn't reach? Well, you can look at parts of the world where it doesn't reach, like the jungles in Colombia or the mountains between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Or closer to home, you can see what happened when the police decided not to go into Watts because they didn't want to risk their lives. All hell broke loose. Or you can go into many of the cities of our country where there's ghettos and the police don't like to go in there, and the gangs, because it's all divided into territories and gangs, they control what goes on from street to street, and life is short and perilous in these places. So it's not only the criminals that are domestic criminals, but also the foreign tyrants. Foreign tyrants, some of them are also predators, and we have to deal with them. Security agencies are not good enough to be able to deal with these foreign tyrants. You need a modern military by a central government to be able to deal with them effectively. They will send you a bigger note, like to Honolulu.
It's
like,
fine. You want to know?
Yeah, I'll take 2 more minutes. Kim Jong-il will send you a little note to Honolulu and saying, hey, guess what? My missiles can reach Honolulu now, so you have to pay up. Now, if you don't have a deterrent and you don't have a defense agency or an alliance or whatever security agency that can deter this, Honolulu has to pay up. You have to deal with these tyrants and their extortions and robbery. And they are also incentivized to get more hardware to be able to, as I said before, increase the pool of potential victims and make more money. So that's why anarchism incentivizes more criminality, and it will increase crime exponentially. So, thirdly, disagreements between reasonable citizens will also lead to gang warfare. Most people will naturally act to form groups or alliances in an attempt to enforce enforce agreements, protect themselves, and punish aggressors or swindlers. There will necessarily be differences of opinion regarding who is right and who is wrong in the various conflicts between members of opposing alliances. Some of these alliances will try to use physical force to make the member of the other alliance comply. The other alliance may resist with force, and you have a little war. With thousands of alliances and millions of disagreements, you only need a small percentage of people to decide to use physical force to end up with a bloody hell of war everywhere. Under anarchism, every kind of disagreement has the potential of becoming a mini war. Disagreements like whether somebody is the murderer or not, whether they violated the contract or not, whether they stole the money or not, whether an action should be a crime or not, and that one in particular increases exponentially, because now you just don't have one law, you have as many laws and legal systems as there are defense agencies, security agencies, and if you bring it down, even as many as the amount of individuals that there are. So they'll have arguments and disputes and differences about whether a certain action is a crime or not, whether the punishment is appropriate or not, etc. With millions of such disagreements and some people's decision to try to impose their view by force, you will have mini wars everywhere.
Yeah.
These mini wars, what?
Yeah, you've gone on 14 minutes already.
Okay. Wait. I'm going to take 2 more minutes. Under anarchy, these mini wars have collateral damage in the form of innocent victims, as well as drawing other people into the fight. Some of these fights will become feuds and vendettas passed on from generation to generation. In contrast, under a limited government, the disagreements are limited to the parties involved and they have finality. Finally, under anarchy, we would not reap all the benefits of free markets we now take for granted. Free markets do not work optimally if they can't count on enforcement of contracts and agreements. This is evidenced by all of history and a visit to any third world country where the legal system does not work well. If you cannot trust that the contract will be enforced, you will be very reluctant to contract or invest. When there is just one government, you know that you can enforce that contract. Now, let's talk a little bit about NAP, because that seems to be like where a lot of differences. I asked myself some questions.
16 minutes. I'm in.
What?
You've gone on for 16 minutes, to be fair. So Walter got 10, you got 16.
Go ahead. Okay, we'll talk about NAP later.
All right. Walt, do you have some questions you want to ask? You have 12 questions there.
Can I comment on what he said? I have some reactions to what he said.
You have a rebuttal period.
There's a rebuttal at the end. I think you want.
Oh.
You have a rebuttal period later. Now is the time to ask the questions. You didn't do the time to just go away. No.
Okay. Do I ask one question and then he answers, or do I ask 5 questions in a row?
Well,
No,
you'll ask 12 questions in a row, but he'll answer them. So you'll ask you'll ask 12 in a row, and he'll ask 12.
12 in a row? Couldn't I ask?
No, you ask a question, I'll answer it. You ask another question, I'll answer it.
I think that's better rather than asking 12 questions.
Right. That's what he meant.
Okay, great. First question, is aggression justified?
Sometimes.
Could you give me an example when aggression is justified? Initiatory aggression?
Oh, well, that's a different issue. Obviously, aggression is justified in self-defense, and that's not initiatory aggression. aggression, initiating aggression can be justified in a case of extreme duress. So, you want an example, or?
Yeah, give me an example.
Like, you're drowning, and you grab there's a lifeboat there, and then you grab onto it, and the guy says, "This is my private property. Let go." And you'd say, "Well, I'll pay you for it," and he says, "No, I can't let you hang on here." And so I would violate his right of private property and hang on. What would you do?
Well, you know, it's interesting. That question comes up with the flagpole case. You're on the 25th floor on a deck, and you fall to the 15th floor, and happily there's a flagpole, and you start inching your way down the flagpole, and what you want to do is go into that person's apartment and go back up to the 25th floor. And that person says, "Let go." And my claim in my writings on this is that it's unjustified to ask a libertarian, "What should you do?" The only proper question you can ask is, if the person in the house shoots you for attempting to trespass, is that person a murderer? And I would say no, that person isn't a murderer. And to make it...
But wait a second, is there another question?
Well, you asked him, what does it justify, and he's responding to that.
We're having a conversation.
I'll ask him later in my questions when I'll ask him, so he'll have a chance to explain.
Okay. Okay. So my second question is,
or third.
Or third. I'm losing count here. Does the government necessarily employ initiatory aggression against all of its citizens by forcing them to pay taxes?
No, as I explained in my opening statement, the government is constituted and created on the premise that the people want and need the government to protect their individual rights. Those people are just paying for a service that they have required. Now, there's some people that want the service and they don't want to pay. Then that's like any service that you receive, and you wanted a service, but then you just want a freeload on it. And then there's another group, very small group, that actually think their life would be better if they didn't pay. I mean, if there was no government, and they don't want to pay for that service because they think that they don't need it, and they can live fine without it. And as I said in my opening statement, a kind, respectful, limited government would have a procedure for these people to transition into a territory, part of the United States, where they could live without any government and implement what they consider to be the optimal political model, which they think is no government at all. And I think it would be, and I think it's this solution is good for the anarchists, because if it doesn't work out, they can come back. And it's also good for the people that believe in limited government, because if it works out to be great, we can see that experiment and then go over to this territory and increase that model as the preferred model. So, and by the way, my own opinion is that I would like the statist government to offer me, as a limited government person, the same procedure. So I can, and my fellow limited government people can transition to a part of the United States where we can implement limited government without all the statist infractions of our rights, and we can reap the benefit of having considered to be the optimal social organization, the best political system. So I'm only suggesting what I want for myself.
I have a question for Daniel. In this session, I'm supposed to limit my questions to 1 minute, and Jan is supposed to limit his answers to 2 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think it was actually less than that, but
Yeah,
it's okay.
I'm just
yeah.
checking. Okay. Next question, Jan. What evidence do you have that any person agreed to be under the regime of a government?
Well, there's a lot of implied consent. First of all, in our country, we have a constitution, and luckily, it explicitly states the kind of government that we expect to have. The people come here. The immigrants, almost everybody was an immigrant. They come here. They know what the system is, so you assume that they consent to that government, that they want that system. That's why they came to the United States, and they didn't go to Russia. So that's the beginning of it. When you are born into the system, you're a minor, so you don't have the judgment to decide whether you can stay or not. When you become an adult, as I said before, there should be a procedure for you to be able to transition into another part of the territory. If you don't want to be part of the United States anymore, you want to renounce your citizenship and create your own country. And I would say that when these people participate in all the social life and benefits, as far as I know, about 99% of the people do want to have a government and do prefer to have laws that are uniform, that apply to everyone, and do think it's necessary for them to have these laws in order for their rights to be protected and to have optimal living. So I don't know if you have a different opinion, but that's how it seems to me.
Okay.
My next question is, Jan, I now claim you owe me $1,000. This is all hypothetical. You don't actually owe me $1,000.
Okay.
Now, but let's play act. I now claim you owe me $1,000. Surely you would be very curious as to the source of my claim. You'd say, well, did I sign a contract? Did I lose it in a bet? You know, you want some evidence. And if I said, well, there was an implied consent that you owed me $1,000, you would reject that very harshly. And yet, when I say, what evidence do you have that anyone consented to this government, even you never signed anything with the government, you never signed any contract with the government, and you give me this implied consent. I don't accept implied consent. You wouldn't accept it for a stinking lousy $1,000, and yet you would accept it for being ruled by this monstrous government. I don't understand how you can say that there's any consent.
Okay. Every social organization has implicit in it some principles, some values, and that's no different with our government. They also have implicit some principles and some values, and that's why I say there's implied is the consent when you stay here, when you enjoy living here, when you participate in all the benefits of the society that you're living in. You are implicitly consenting. Now, I have given you an out, which is, you know, maybe you don't want to be here, you don't want to have a government, you don't think it's necessary, and if this was a problem, which apparently it is for the anarchists, then I think they should have the possibility of creating their own anarchist society, which is incompatible with the limited government society, because either you have a government or you don't, either the laws apply to everyone or you don't, and they can live in this new territory and experiment with anarchism, and I'd like to see what happens.
Well, you know, I'm not against implied consent, for example, or not necessarily against implied consent. For example, here's the following scenario. I go into a restaurant and I order a cup of coffee and I drink it, and then they present me with a bill for $10 million. And I would say, if they want $10 million for their coffee, they have to, put up a big sign or get me my signature or something like that. They just can't charge me $1 million. But this implied consent for something so important as the government, I think, is highly problematic. Spooner has a book, The Constitution of No Authority, and what he says is he goes over all these, indications as to why people really consented. One, they paid taxes, and he rejects that on the grounds that you pay booty to the robber, and that doesn't prove anything. And then he says, well, people vote. Does that imply consent? He says, no. If you were a slave and you voted for a good overseer rather than a bad overseer, it doesn't mean you approve slavery. And then he says, well, people...
Walter, that's very interesting, and I don't mean to interrupt you.
Let me finish.
It's not a question.
Well, I'm getting to it. I have a minute.
Okay.
I have a minute to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
And the third one he goes over, and that's the one that you keep relying on, is the fact that people stay here. But the problem with that, Spooner says, is that's circular. That assumes that the government has the authority to run things in any case. So how do you react to these three arguments of Spooner?
Well, as I was trying to explain before, I think that every society has certain principles implied. When you go there, it means you accept that. When you stay there and enjoy life there, it means that you accept that. When you don't say, look, I want to transition out of this country into a territory where we can do anarchism, then you don't do that. You're implicitly accepting that you accept the idea that there should be a government and that there should be a law that is applicable to everyone, not just the people that agree to the law and decide these people that say, well, I don't agree and I want to secede, I'm a government myself, all by myself. They disagree with that. So I think, really, in the case, it is implied based on your actions. If you don't want to leave and stay in the country, I'm not saying that you have to go out. I'm not saying that you have to sell your stuff. You can sell it or not. You just buy into the territory and then you organize with other like-minded people. And in the meantime, we're assuming that you've accepted this. Now, if you don't, then you have a procedure to get out. That's all I'm saying.
Let me try this one on you.
Hold on. Let me interrupt. As the moderator, I have to make sure people answer questions. And to be fair, you didn't really answer.
Wait a second, Daniel. You cannot interrupt like that.
I have to make sure you answer questions.
No. You cannot make a judgment without somebody, one of the debaters, saying to you, he didn't answer this question.
Fine.
And what it was, so you look, this is the problem with debating two anarchists, and I won't do it.
I'm not debating you.
So you have to control yourself, and you can only be the moderator. You can only, if you know the procedure, which is if you think
right, but one of the things you
mentioned thinks that his question was not answered, he has to raise it, and then we have to discuss that.
Fine.
But you can't modus proprio.
Fine.
Go ahead and and tell, hey, you didn't answer the question, or I didn't like your answer.
Fine. Walter, did he answer your question?
I don't think
you can't even do that.
I don't think he's answering my questions. As Ayn Rand would say, I think he's running like hell.
Okay, you want to discuss it? Well,
let me speak now.
Yeah.
I think that I ask a question, you just go on and on with irrelevancy. So I certainly agree with Daniel. You're not answering my questions, but I also please don't interrupt me. But I also agree with you that I don't think that the focus of the moderator should be to make any point of substance. And so I agree with you, Jan, that even that Daniel should not tell you that you're not answering the question. That should be my province. I don't think you are answering the question, but let me continue. I live in New York City, and I go to I have to go through Harlem in order to get to my job. Harlem is a high crime area, and every day I go and every day I get mugged, and I keep going. Does that mean that I implicitly accepted being mugged?
Do you go into Harlem and you get mugged and you keep going? And yeah, are you asking me, are you implicitly accepting that it's okay for you to get mugged?
Yes.
No, you're implicitly accepting the risk that you might get mugged. That's what you're implicitly accepting, but you're not saying, okay, it's okay to mug me. You're saying, well, I'm willing to take the chance, and I'm implicitly accepting that there's a risk of being mugged, so I'm going to go to Harlem. And that's part of what's happening as a citizen of the United States. From your perspective, you think you're getting mugged, but I gave you an out, so I hope you're happier now.
No, I'm not very happy because the out would be to not go to Harlem. The logic, I think, I have problems with your logic here. What you're saying is that I live here, I pay taxes, and therefore I implicitly accept the government, and not the risk of the government, the actual government, and yet you don't act logically and conclude, as you should, I think, if you were going to be logical here, that when I go to Harlem, then I'm accepting not only the risk, but I'm accepting the mugging, because Harlem is the Harlem mugger is no different than the government mugger. In both cases, I'm going and I'm implicitly accepting it according to your logic. So what difference do you see between the Harlem muggers and the government, given that I didn't agree to either one? If you say, well, by living here, I've implicitly accepted the government, well, then by going through Harlem, I'm implicitly accepting being mugged every day.
Yeah. What I said was that implicit in the actions of the people, the founding fathers, and from then on all the people that came to the United States, they knew what the situation was. They came here because they wanted to be here. That's how this country was founded, and that's how it formed, and that's why people came. They wanted to be in the United States. They accepted by their travels to the United States that they wanted to live in the United States. Now, if you ask the people whether they want a government or not, they will say, yeah, we want a government. And so your view that the people didn't accept it now is incorrect. If you just do a survey, and you'll see people want to have a government, so it's not being imposed. People think that they need a government. They want and need a government. That's their view. So when they are being required to pay for the protection of the individual rights, their rights are not being violated, and so that's why I say that either explicitly or implicitly they've accepted it.
Look, every day I live in the United States, you say there's an implied consent. That the fact that I live here implies that I've consented to it. Every day I go to Harlem and I get mugged, and you don't say that I've accepted that implicitly. Why the difference?
Well, actually, there's a difference in the sense that what you're talking about here is the context of forming a government. If you reject the context of forming the government and you say, no, I don't want any government, it's a different context. In other words, you are having a position that is completely different than the people that are living there and want to have a government and think they need to have a government. And if you ask them, they're saying, yes, I don't consider myself to be mugged. I consider I'm being protected. Your analogy implies that the government is mugging you. I dispute that. I don't think they are mugging you. Maybe you are one of the very few people that is being mugged, in your mind at least. And so you should have an option not to be mugged, and I've provided it for you.
I've asked this question 4 or 5 times now, and in my view, you haven't even come close to answering it. I'll try one last time. What you say is the fact that I live here shows that there's implied consent because I stay in the United States. Sometimes I travel other countries, but pretty much I stay in the United States, and you're saying that there's implied consent. I give you another case where I go to Harlem every day and I get mugged every day, and you say that there's not implied consent, and I ask you why the difference, and you start talking about surveys of people agreeing and you're going to give me an out. You're not answering my question.
Which is the question?
The question is why the difference? If you think that my actions of living here.
Well, I'm going to tell you what the difference is.
Wait! Don't interrupt me, please. This is the second time you've interrupted me. I've not interrupted you once. Please don't interrupt me.
I thought you wanted me to answer. It's okay.
I do, but not in the middle of my sentence. I'm trying not to interrupt you, and so far I haven't, and you've done it twice. So please don't interrupt me, and I'll continue not to interrupt you. What you say, and this is the last time I'm going to answer it because you don't seem willing to answer it, and we might as well move on to other things if you're not going to answer my questions. What you say is the fact that I live here shows implied consent because I keep doing it. I keep living here. So I give you another case where I keep doing something, going to Harlem, and I keep getting mugged, and here obviously there's no implied consent. What is the bloody difference?
Well, I'm going to tell you the difference is that the government is not mugging you. You are paying them for a service that you need. You dispute that. But this is what this country was formed on, and all other countries in the world. Every country in the world, every social organization, all the modern states are based on that idea that you need a government. Now, you dispute that, but the way the people see it that are living here is that they are paying for a service. They are not being mugged. You understand? That's the difference between the analogy.
Okay, let me try another one on you. I come up to you with a gun, Jan. Here's my gun. You can see the gun on the screen. And I say, give me your money or I'll blow your head off. And you say, but I'm a philosophical robber, so I'm willing to dialogue with you. And you say, tut, 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 you're a libertarian. Isn't this an outrage for a libertarian to do that? And I say, oh, you're right. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a service, and then I give you the wrapping of this. I have a cough drop here, and I give you the wrapping paper of the cough drop, and I say, here's the service. And the point is that it's not enough to give the government gives you a service. It has to be one that you've agreed to, and no one has agreed. You have no evidence that no one signed anything. No one signed the bloody Constitution that you keep talking about. If the Constitution was a contract, in other words, if it was really a club, if it was like the U.S. government club or the tennis club or the golf club, everyone would sign. But nobody signed the bloody Constitution that you keep relying on. How can you then say that we've agreed?
As I explained before, because there is implied consent. It means that the people understand the country that they're coming to. They come here because they agree with the contract. The people that are living here, they're born here. Their parents gave consent. They decided that they wanted to continue to live here, and they participate in all the benefits, and they are happy with it. They don't think that they can live well without a government. They want to pay for the service. Now, they don't want to get ripped off, and they don't want to be pay for services that they aren't receiving. And that's why redistribution of wealth is wrong, and the government shouldn't do it. But they do think they need a government, and so they aren't getting this paltry service like you think in your analogy. They are getting a service that they think that they want and need. Now, you happen to be in a small minority of people that think that this service is worthless. And so the solution, since somebody has to give, because either the people that think they're receiving a service are right, or the people like you that think that they're not receiving any worthwhile service are right, somebody has to give. And there's only one way to do that, is to live in different territories. And I don't know how else I can explain it.
Okay, I'm going to stop asking that question because I haven't had it answered and I'm tired of asking it. So let me ask a different question. You mentioned that different people have differing views on what constitutes non-aggression, and so instead of having people fighting over this, you suggest that government determines this so that people know beforehand what the law is instead of having ex post facto law. My question is that how is it that the government knows what constitutes non-aggression but people outside the political arena don't?
I don't really understand what you're asking, Walter. Do you want to explain that question to me? Because
why is the government so smart that they know what non-aggression is, but private courts wouldn't be able to know this? Why are private courts stupid and government courts smart?
Well, I'm not saying that the private courts will not necessarily know. They may or may not know. What I was saying was that I made quite a few arguments about how not having a government incentivizes crime. It creates gang warfare, and there's no finality in the judgments because ultimately one of these security agencies that has more weaponry than the other can impose their will, and they can rip off anybody they want because there is no control over them other than greater force. So they could decide properly, but there's all these problems are still there, and that's why we need a state with a limited government.
Okay, next question. If you have the right to defend yourself, then doesn't government violate such a right by preventing competition? And if you don't have the right to private police, military, and courts, then how does the government acquire such a right?
You have the right to defend yourself, and you have delegated part of that right to the government to provide the service of protecting your individual rights. So that's the answer.
Okay, well, we're getting back to the same thing, and I would say, you know, I haven't delegated squat, and you would say I did implicitly. We'll get off that. Let me ask you this one. Where do you feel safer? In Disney World, where private police protect you, or in Central Park or Audubon Park in New Orleans, where government police protect you?
I feel safer. Let's assume that they're good. I'll go along with your analogy, and let's assume that they're good private service and everything. And I think the odds are that there's more protection in the Disney park.
But if there's more protection in Disney Park, that shows that the reason there's more protection in Disney Park is because it's a part of the competition. Namely, the Disney private police are competing against other people's private police, and yet you favor a government monopoly. So isn't that a little inconsistent?
No, because the private security system in Disney is backed up and in the context of a government. It's in the context of a government that is being provided with all the benefits of having a government to back them up and to resolve the problems and differences. And if for example, a bunch of a criminal gang comes in there that can overpower them, then they just call the government and ask them, hey, we need some more firepower here, and come and rescue us. And that's what they would do. So that's why it's different.
They call upon a government that has killed, among other governments, has killed almost 200 million people of their own citizens. But I think I've asked. I think
you're asking me if the government in the United States has killed 200 million citizens of its own people?
No, I didn't say that. I said
Well,
that.
I think this is your last question.
Okay. I've had enough. I've asked probably more than a dozen questions. Let it be his turn, because I noticed that the questions go for about 15 seconds and the answers go for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. So I'm ready to get more time, because I think so far he's had much more time to talk than I have.
All right. Jan, your turn to ask questions.
Well, I'm sorry that you feel that way. The moderator could interrupt me if I went over the limit. So, what are the limits? Are what, 1 minute to ask?
The responses were about 2 minutes each. They weren't 5. They were about 2 minutes each.
Well, they felt like 5.
It just felt like.
Nevertheless. Okay.
So my first question is it ever justified to initiate physical force against someone who has not violated anybody's rights?
No. Boy, that's a quick answer.
Okay. So, if you were dying of thirst, would you try to steal some water if the only person that had some refused to give or sell you any? Say you were lost in the woods and you finally found a place where they had a house, a cabin, and you're dying of thirst, and they say no, and then there's a well there. Would you try to steal some?
That's an improper question to ask a libertarian, as I try to indicate with the flag example. The only proper question to ask a libertarian is not what would you do, but suppose I started grabbing their water against their will and they shot me, would they be guilty of murder? And my answer is no, they would not be guilty of murder. They'd be guilty of defending their own private property. And I think that the problem with these type of extreme examples is it loses sight of the context, and context is very important. The reason we have these emergency situations, 99% of them, is because of government. When government gets in there and violates private property rights, everything falls apart. If we had a free market system, even a limited government, limited to 5%, armies, courts, and police, the way Ayn Rand would have it, or Ron Paul perhaps, you wouldn't have too many of these emergency situations. We have dozens, hundreds of emergency situations because government is screwing up the works. No, I'm a big supporter of private property rights. And if someone was inching his way down into my house on this flagpole, or someone was grabbing my water, and I used physical force to stop them, I would not be guilty of a crime.
Okay, moderator.
Yeah.
I don't think he answered my question because he said my question was improper.
No, I think.
And you think that there are some questions that are improper for libertarians?
I think he did answer it.
So what is the answer?
I think his answer was, as long as I am punished for doing it, the fact that I would do it is sort of irrelevant. Whether I do it, whether I don't do it. So
he's not answering the question of whether he would steal the water or not. He's answering a different question. And because he says that's a question that's improper for libertarians, which is quite interesting, because apparently there are some questions that are improper for libertarians, and the rest of the world have to answer them, but not libertarians. No, I disagree. A question is a question, and he didn't answer it. And if you say he answered it, because you said right now that he answered it, you tell me, was it a yes or a no?
I'll try to do better.
No, I'm asking the moderator, because he says that you answered
the question in terms of...
was it a yes or a no?
It wasn't a yes or no answer.
Okay, and so it was neither. And was it a yes or no question?
It was a yes or no question.
So he didn't answer the question.
I'll try again. The question is, would I steal this guy's water? I don't know. It depends. If I did, I would be acting against the non-aggression principle, and I think the non-aggression principle is very important. Let me try again. Let me answer it maybe a little circuitously. Let me give you my...
I got your answer.
Notice you're interrupting me.
Oh, well, I thought that... Go ahead. You want to talk a little more? Go ahead.
Third time you've interrupted me. Let me try again. What about the case of the Nazi concentration camp guard who is a libertarian? Let me give you this as an answer. Look, you didn't answer any of my questions either, so why should I answer yours? But let me continue. Here's the deal with libertarian Nazi concentration camp guards. A Nazi concentration camp guard has to kill 100 people a day, Jews, gypsies, gays, whoever. However, I become a Nazi concentration camp guard, and I only kill 90 people a day, and I can get away with it. If I killed fewer, then they would unearth me, and I wouldn't be able to be a concentration camp guard. So at the end of the week, I've killed 90 times 7, 630 people, but I saved 70 people. But I killed I killed a whole bunch of people, and now the Nuremberg trials come. And the question is, what is to be done with me? And my answer to that question is, I killed 630 people, and according to my view of libertarian punishment theory, if any of the heirs of the victims want me to be put to death, I should be put to death. I should be put to death because I killed an innocent person. But my motive for doing this was not to kill innocent people, it was rather to save innocent people, and I did save 70 people, 10 a day for a week. And what I would do is I would go to the heirs of all the victims and say, look, I wish I had saved your brother, your uncle, your cousin, whatever. I couldn't. I could only save 10 people a day. And the reason I did this was to save these 10 people a day. And if any of you wants me executed, well, then I killed somebody. I violated the non-aggression principle, and I should be made to pay for it. Would I do this? Well, probably I would. I would probably. So to answer your question, is this the fourth time you're interrupting me? I can't believe it. You complain about Stephan Kinsella interrupting you all the time, and now you're doing this.
He's just about done.
I can't hear you.
I think he was talking to me, asking if time's up, and I'm saying.
But he's not allowed to do that. You're supposed to be the timekeeper. I didn't ask you to be a better timekeeper when I thought he went on and on. I think this is the fourth time, but who's counting when you're having fun interrupting? So, but I insist that before I be put to death, I should be given a medal because I saved 70 people. So to answer your question, is it ever justified to violate the non-aggression principle? No, it's never justified to do it, in the sense that if you do it, you must be punished for it. Because at bottom, what libertarianism is, superficially, it's just the non-aggression principle, don't violate. But more deeply, the essence of libertarianism is a punishment theory. If you violate the non-aggression principle, you should be punished for it. So if I grab somebody's water, I should be punished for it, even if it means to save my life. Now I've answered your question.
So if it's not justified, how come you don't know what you would do? Would you then do something that you think is wrong?
Well, I'm not sure. It's a very personal question. You have to be in the situation. I think that I would take on the Nazi concentration camp guard, and I would kill 630 people, innocent people, in order to save 70. This is the trolley case where you're supposed to divert the trolley away from killing 5 people, so it only kills 1 person. I think if you do it, you're a murderer. And possibly it's justified to be a murderer under these circumstances, provided that you take the punishment for it, because the essence of libertarianism, as I see it, is to pay for violations of the non-aggression principle. I just wonder what this has got to do with anarchism, but that's a different issue.
Well, I don't think that you answered my question, which is, if you think it's wrong, why do you say you don't know if you would do it? Would you do something that you think is wrong?
I might, not so much to save my own life, but if my son's life or my daughter's life were at stake, I might violate the law. But if I did, I would be guilty of a law violation. I would be subject to punishment, just punishment. But don't be so unhappy that I'm not answering your questions. You didn't answer mine either, so we're even.
Well, what's the point in somebody advocating a moral principle if when you ask them, are you going to do something that you think is wrong, you say, well, yeah, I might. That doesn't really make any difference what they think if they're willing to violate their principles. So what's the big deal about advocating this principle or the other principle if you say you would violate a principle that you think is right? You would do what you think is wrong.
Well, I don't think that libertarianism is really concerned about morality. Libertarianism is concerned with a very narrow aspect of morality, namely, what is just law? And the only question that I can answer as a libertarian, and I'm going on this show as a libertarian, not as some guy off the street. My expertise, if I have any, is as a libertarian. So I think it's an unjust question to ask a libertarian. And as I say, my expertise, given that I have any, is as a libertarian, because libertarianism is not a moral theory. You want to sort of push me into this box of morality, and I don't really want to go there. I mean, the question of like, is it moral to be overweight or to be drunk or something like that is not a libertarian question. So I think it's an improper question to ask of a libertarian. The libertarian question. So libertarianism, in my view, is not involved in morality. It's just involved in what the proper law should be. And what the proper law should be is the non-aggression principle, namely keep your mitts off yourself and do not aggress. And this is why I oppose statism, because statism is per se a violation of that, because there is no implied consent. The government never asked me to delegate anything to it. The government never asked anyone, and a question of whether you took a survey of people and whether they would agree to delegate anything, I think, is irrelevant. The bottom line is that the government has the audacity to tax me, to demand money from me, and if I refuse to pay it, they're going to put me in jail, and if I resist, they're going to shoot me. And it seems that the government is violating the non-aggression principle, and I think that if this debate is going to be on anarchism versus minarchism, we should function not so much on morality, but rather on the evils of statism.
Well, I'm interviewing you or debating you as a human being and trying to find out what your ethical underpinnings are. And I'm outstanded that you haven't figured out whether you should save your life or not. You say at one point that you don't know. Another point you say you will do things that you think are wrong. And so I'm saying, well, what's the point in doing the homework and figuring out what's right and what's wrong if you aren't willing to do what you say you think you should? And this is the problem with the way some libertarians hold the principle of non-aggression. They hold it as an irreducible primary, as a starting point in ethics, and that's why they misapply it, and that's why they are willing to lose their life, like Larkin Rose and other people that I've interviewed, where rather than violate somebody's property rights, they're willing to sacrifice their life. They haven't organized their thinking and that's why they misapply the NAP principle. So I disagree with you on, you think that politics is separate from ethics. All of politics is based on an ethical view, and ultimately you have to prove that your political theory is good. And good is an ethical concept, and that's why I'm investigating your ethics. And I see you haven't figured it out, and unfortunately you don't have too much time left. But anyway, I'll ask you a different question. Either some DROs have nuclear weapons or none do.
I didn't hear a word. Either some what? Bureaus?
Security agencies.
Sorry.
However you call them. There's two possibilities, that they have nuclear weapons or they don't. So let's examine them each one at a time so we cover the whole universe. If they didn't have nuclear weapons, what would you recommend a city do, like I suggested before, Honolulu, if Putin or Kim Jong-il threatened to nuke the city if they didn't pay $10 billion? Let's suppose they don't have nuclear weapons. That's the first scenario.
Well, I sort of object to the question a little bit. I don't like Kim Jong-il or Putin. I'd rather it be Bush or the United States, because if there's any aggressor, it's the United States. The United States has, what is it, about 1,000 military bases in about 150 different countries, and they demand all sorts of things from those countries, whereas Putin, in my view, is much less warlike than Obama. Obama is in Afghanistan, Obama is in Iraq, Obama is in Cuba, Guantanamo, Obama is in about 160 different countries, and I don't mean to pick on Obama, but the United States is there. So I would turn the question around a little bit and say, suppose the United States has weapons, and they now make a threat against, I don't know, Liechtenstein, and they say, unless Liechtenstein does things, we're going to nuke you. Well, what should the Liechtensteinians do? Well, if somebody held a gun on me and said, give me your money or I'll blow your head off, I'd give them my money, and probably Liechtenstein should do whatever the U.S. says, otherwise they're going to pulverize them. The U.S. is the only one that actually dropped nuclear, well, not nuclear, but atomic bombs on innocent people. So I would turn the question around a little bit, and I would say that this wonderful government with its great constitution is a mass murderer, and it's a very powerful mass murder. So probably my utilitarian advice to Liechtenstein or any small country that the U.S. was bullying is to let them bully you. Better. What is it? Better not red than dead, but better U.S. imperialist satrap than dead.
Well, what you're arguing is against statist policies, which I object to as well. I don't think we should be involved in any wars that are not defensive, and so it's irrelevant to this debate because I'm not a statist. And what I do think is that you haven't answered the question as to what you, under the anarchist scenario, the anarchists would, when they didn't have any nuclear weapons, they would just have to pay up. Whereas right now, with a central government, they don't have to pay up, because we have a central government that has superior war power and military hardware. And so we are not, if we just had the right foreign policy, which is not to get ourselves involved in the rest of the world's wars and be pushing people around and threatening them and all that, which I object to, we could live fine right here. But if we had anarchy, we would be subject to these extortions. And where would it end? Well, we would have to give up all our wealth eventually. So isn't that the case?
No, I disagree. First of all, I disagree when you say you're not a statist. You most certainly are a statist. You support states. To me, a statist is someone who supports states, and someone who supports states is a statist, a limited statist, but still a statist. Now, with regard to this business, the reason that the U.S. doesn't have to worry about Liechtenstein, and Liechtenstein does have to worry about the United States, is not because one is a state and the other isn't a state. I mean, Liechtenstein has got a government too, so it's just two governments quarreling with each other, and I don't see how that gets us anywhere on our debate of statism versus non-statism or anarchism. Look, suppose the U.S. were...
I want an answer to my question.
I think he did answer your question.
Wait, the sixth interruption?
The answer was we have the problem now still with the government, so what difference does it make?
Wait a second.
What?
Wait a second. I'm in the middle of my answer, and this is the sixth time he's interrupted me.
I'm sorry.
The timekeeper...
He's not answering your question. You know, when I said you weren't answering his question, Jen, you said I was, but he did answer your question. His question was, your scenario involves one government attacking another government, so it's not solved by having a state, because the state is still vulnerable even if you have a government. Right?
No, my question, let me clarify my question.
I want to get back to the fact that this is the second time this man has interrupted me. He had a rough time with Stefan Kinsella continually interrupting him. Yeah, I promised him that I wouldn't interrupt him, and I assumed he wouldn't interrupt me, but he keeps interrupting me. Now, look, if I'm going over time, Jan, it's not your province to tell me that. It's his, Daniel's province. He's the timekeeper, and I trusted Daniel to be your timekeeper. You have to trust him to be my timekeeper. Now, I didn't finish answering my question, the question that you put to me. What you said is if some weak place were threatened by some strong place, but this has got nothing to do with government. Look, suppose that we had anarchism in the United States, we didn't have any government. We just had anarchism in the United States. And the United States is as powerful as it is now, and it had, maybe 10 or 20 defense agencies. And some little pipsqueak country like, I don't know, Liechtenstein or North Korea threatened to bomb us. Probably the reaction was we would die laughing. This reminds me of a story on my campus, and on many campuses they have these Take Back the Night rape marches, and I once wrote an article saying, well, this would work because the rapists will be convulsively laughing. They'll be rolling on the floor laughing, so this will stop rape for about 5 minutes. The powers that be at my university didn't much like it. See, the problem, what you're doing in your question is you're conflating two things, one power and the other statism, and you're saying, well, the United States is powerful and it's a state, and therefore we don't have to worry because it's a state. No, we don't have to worry because we're very powerful. If Ron Paul had his way and the U.S. government limited itself to just purely defense, well, then we would have nothing to worry about, whether we had nukes or not, because we have, look, suppose North Korea does have a nuke and we didn't have a nuke, the United States didn't have a nuke, and they threatened Honolulu, or they threatened any part of the United States, and these defense agencies would have contracts with each other so that if any foreign North Korea threatened one, we would all gang up on him. We would just pulverize them with conventional weapons. So it's not a matter of a government, it's a matter of power, and you seem to be conflating those two. And please don't interrupt me anymore.
Jen? Jan, you there?
It's your picture is frozen there.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Another question?
I want to ask a question to the moderator. So he answered, he got, I don't know how many minutes first, and then I asked for whether he had answered, and then he got the same amount of minutes again, and he talks about everything else except what I asked. So I was just trying to find out what he believes the government in Honolulu should do under an anarchist scenario when they don't have nuclear weapons and they receive that extortion note. And I think he said, if I'm correct, let me see if I understand the answer, is that he would say they should pay up. Is that right?
No, I didn't say that. I said that they should, after they convulsively laugh, they should attack North Korea with what do you call it, conventional weapons if they don't have nuclear weapons.
So your scenario, okay, well, the same scenario, and they don't have enough military power as security agencies to attack North Korea effectively. What should they do?
Well, now we're getting back to the previous question. If a big bully attacks a little guy, whether one is a state or the other isn't a state, obviously pragmatism indicates that you should give up. I did answer that question. I said if somebody, the seventh interruption again?
It's okay.
Can't you let me finish?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
no, I'm really wondering about you, Jen. You know, you felt so aggrieved by Stefan Kinsella, and now you're doing the same thing. Is it just that Stefan is a better interrupter? I don't know what's with you. Let me finish my bloody my bloody answer. Look,
I'm going to be the only one doing the interruptions. Go ahead.
I'll be happy if that happens, but so far he's almost to 7 or 8 interruptions. But who's counting when you're having fun? Look, the idea, if a ceteris paribus, forget about who's got nuclear weapons and who doesn't. Nuclear weapons aren't the only weapon. If a big bully attacks a little guy and the little guy can't run, and can't hide, the little guy's going to have to pay tribute, and it's got nothing to do with anarchism versus limited governmentism, because you can have bullies that are governments and you can have bullies that are not governments. So the problem that you have is that you keep thinking, you know, the United States is powerful and therefore we don't have to pay tribute, but an anarchist United States wouldn't be powerful. But it seems to me that an anarchist United States would be even more powerful than the present one, because an anarchist society would be a much richer society, and as we learn in environmental economics, wealthier is healthier, namely the richer the society, the more healthy it's going to be and the more able it's going to be to overcome environmental problems. Well, the same thing goes in our present discussion. Wealthier is safer. Wealthier is safer. If we had an anarchist society of the sort that Rothbard advocates, constructivist, where we have adherence to the non-aggression principle, it would be much wealthier. It would be able to laugh at anyone who made a threat to us. We would have a credible counter threat against them. We wouldn't have to pay anyone tribute. But if we were just Liechtenstein, we'd have to pay, even if Liechtenstein was anarchist.
All right.
So your scenario is that these security agencies have sufficient military power to attack another country like North Korea and prevail with conventional weapons. My question is, if they have a dispute between them, all these hundreds of security agencies, and one of them is headed by a neocon, and he attacks the other because he believes in preemption, wouldn't that lead to the destruction of the United States? In other words, if you have a scenario where these defense agencies have enormous amounts of military hardware, enough to prevail over North Korea in a war, wouldn't that expose the United States to a civil war, a war within the United States, where there is some dispute between these security agencies, and one of the leaders or owners of one of the security agencies is a little bit trigger happy, maybe he's a neocon, and he preempts the other? Is that a risk that you face as an anarchist society?
Yeah, sure, you face it as a risk, but here's a joke. An economist was once asked, how is your wife? And the answer was, compared to what? Yes, there's a risk that there could be a civil war, but compared to what? There already is a civil war, and the bad guys won. Namely, the government won, and it's throwing its weight around the world. Let me introduce a new concept that we haven't discussed so far, and that's a thing called legitimacy. And legitimacy is very important, because if you have legitimacy, they say that, the pen is mightier than the sword, and you might think, well, the pen is, this big, and let me put it on the screen. I can't aim it here. There's a pen. The pen is mightier than the sword because, the sword is 3 feet or 4 feet, and the pen is 5 or 6 inches. How can the pen be mightier than the sword? And the answer given by libertarians and other people is that the pen determines in which way the sword is pointed. So legitimacy is very, very important. Now let me get closer to your question. Suppose there are 5 people, A, B, C, D, and E. And A and E are having a dispute. And A goes to its court, B. And A invites E to go to its court, B. And E says, what? Go to B? B is prejudiced in your favor. Let's go to court D, or defense agency D. And defense agencies would be linked up with courts in the Rothbardian situation. And let's suppose that then E invites A to go to D, and A says, well, I'm going to go to D because D is prejudiced in your favor. And now each court decides this case in the absence of the other. Namely, B decides the case with only A's giving evidence, and D decides the case with only E giving evidence. And now if both courts agree, B court and D court agree, well, then they both have armaments and they both have legitimacy, and they'll force the client, whether A or E. Am I out of time?
Yeah, but just wrap up.
No, I need 2 more minutes. I'm allowed to do that, right? Okay, so if both courts agree, then we have no problem. But suppose both courts disagree. Now here's where Rothbard talks about bandit courts, which I assume is the kind of court that you're talking about, where the neocon court or whatever it is. Let's suppose that there are 2 kinds of courts. There's legitimate courts and bandit courts. Bandit courts are the courts you're asking about, so I am sort of answering your question. Well, not sort of, actually answering it. And and here David Friedman makes a contribution too, and he says, look, if the courts are legitimate, the definition of a legitimate court is that they've anticipated the fact that they might on one occasion be on different sides of an issue, and they would then go to C. Remember, I had A, B, C, D, and E. They would go to C, and they would pick C because C is sort of like Daniel. He's our moderator, and we both trust him to be fair. But suppose B, the neocon court, the evil court, says, well, I'm not going to abide by it, my way or the highway. The point is, and here you have to get a little bit of economics, competition and monopoly and all that, and you have to realize that the bandit courts are going to have to fight everybody, other bandit courts and other legitimate courts, whereas the legitimate courts are only going to have to fight the bandit courts. And the way competition works, Fighting is expensive. It's a lot easier to moderate these things. So what's going to happen is that the B court, the bandit court, is going to lose legitimacy, and all the other courts will gang up on it, and they will see it as a pariah, much the way people now see, what's his name, the owner of the basketball team, the Clippers. Everybody thinks he's a pariah, and they're kicking him out of the NBA. So I don't think that there's much danger of this, and my answer is, based on this analysis of legitimacy and of courts fighting each other and negotiating with each other, I think, yes, there's a risk. There's always a risk. Things could blow up, but I think that the risks are much less now than they otherwise would be.
All right, Jan, you have 2 more questions, and then we'll do.
What? That's not right. I haven't asked 10 questions.
I mean, you've asked a lot of the same over and over again.
No, I haven't asked 10 questions. You know that. That's not true.
How many questions have you answered? Yes.
I've only asked 4 questions and some clarifications as to what it is that he answered. That's what's happened so far.
Fine. And we only have to give a minute response.
In the previous answer, he agreed that there is a risk, and he's willing to take that risk of civil war inside the United States. The difference is that the other wars are occurring in Syria or in Afghanistan, and even though they're wrong for us to be involved in the Afghanistan or the Iraqi wars, we are living pretty well in spite of having the wrong foreign policy here. But if you have a civil war, an attack, there's a dispute between 2 security agencies, and one of them decides to resort to force, there's a civil war right here in the United States making life miserable and impossible right here. That's why you need a monopoly of physical force, and you can't have 100 different security agencies with military hardware, which at any moment when they have a dispute, one of them might resort to force and the other one will retaliate, and you have a civil war. So here's my question. Do you think criminal gangs will extort money from individuals that are not organized, as well as security agencies they consider weaker than themselves, under the anarchist scenario?
Yes, I think criminal gangs will try to extort money from people weaker than they are under the anarchist society. There'll always be some criminals. I'm not a Marxist believing in the perfection of human beings. I think there'll always be 1 or 2% criminals. I just think that it'll be less than under government. Right now, government, with its monopoly of force, I think creates criminal gangs in various ways, and I don't think this would happen under anarchy. Now, with regard to Afghanistan and the civil war in Syria there, again, this is an illegitimate question, because what we're supposed to be debating is anarchy versus limited government, and you pick on governments. Afghanistan had a government, and they had a civil war, so that's a debit on your account, and you're trying to somehow make it a debit on the anarchist account, and the same with Syria. Look, the U.S. had a civil war. No, it really wasn't a civil war. It was a war of northern aggression, but that's a minor point. You can always have civil wars, whether it's between anarchism or not, whether there's anarchy or not, and then you have different defense agencies fighting each other, which I think is very, very unlikely. I think it's much more likely that what you're going to have when you have a monopoly government is the monopoly government is going to run roughshod over everybody.
Do you think that some of these security agencies that are attacked by these criminals will fight back and create a little war?
Under anarchy, I don't think that these criminal gangs would dare fight, just as you admitted that you'd feel safer in what was it, Disney World and in Audubon Park, because the people in Disney World came out of a process of competition. I think they would be much better able to stop these gangs, whereas governments create these gangs. In Mexico, talk about armaments. Mexico is a government, and yet with their drug policy, which I'm sure you don't favor, the criminal gangs fight them almost on an equal basis due to the drug laws. But the point is that what you're trying to do is say, to me, it's a comparative situation. Under which case is war or fighting more likely? And I say it's much more likely under present status situations than under anarchism. You never really confronted my issue of world government. If you really accepted your view against anarchism, you would think that the anarchy between various governments is a problem, and you would favor world government, and yet I'm sure you don't. So I don't see how you can continually use, supposedly against my side of this debate, governments. I don't favor governments. I don't favor the government of Afghanistan. I don't favor the government of Syria. I don't favor any government. And you try to use governments to undermine anarchism, and by saying, well, the what do you call it? The defense agencies will fight. But I've given reasons with my A, B, C, D, E analysis and my point about legitimacy. I think it's very unlikely that that would occur. It's much more likely that when you have governments, there's fighting.
All right.
I had asked you whether these criminal gangs would extort money from organized people or individuals and security agencies they consider weaker than themselves. Then when you answer my next question, would those weaker security agencies retaliate, or of equal level, you say, I don't think that they would attack them because they are stronger. That's not the premise of the question. The premise was that they were weaker or equal in strength. Would some of those agencies, those security agencies, retaliate against these criminal gangs, and as I said in my presentation, create a gang warfare and create a proliferation of wars between these organizations, creating civil war and bloody hell right here in the United States, not in Syria, not in Afghanistan, not someplace in your neighborhood. Tanks and missiles there in your neighborhood. That's what I'm asking.
Well, I think I've already answered that, but I'll try again because I don't think it got through. If there were a weak defense agency, I think what it would do is call upon all other defense agencies and say, hey, look, there's this either a criminal gang or a bandit court, and it's attacking us. And they would all coalesce together. So, look, your question is, suppose a strong gang like the Blood or the Crips or the Mafia would attack a weak defense agency, you say the Acme Defense Agency. My answer is the Acme Defense Agency, first of all, they would never do it because they would realize that the Acme Defense Agency would call upon all the other defense agencies surrounding it and say, look, there's this gang attacking us, and if they attack us successfully, guess what? They're going to come after you, so you better help us. Plus, we already have a contract with each other, unlike the non-contract that we don't have with the government, and there would be this illegitimacy. I mean, the reason that the government is able to engage in all sorts of depredations is because it has some legitimacy, because it bought off the intellectual classes. If it didn't have this legitimacy, again, the sword or the rifle would be turned in the opposite direction. This has occurred, I think, in I forget, I'm not sure if it was in Ukraine or not, where when the orders came down from the government to shoot the rabble, the military turned the guns around and shot the people giving the orders. So legitimacy is very important, and I think that the defense agencies would have this legitimacy, that is the legitimate defense agencies, vis-a-vis whether it's bandit courts or non-governmental gangs.
So the premise of my question had been, if they had acquired military hardware, which they're incentivized to do because there's no government, they would then attack agencies that they considered weaker. Sometimes they would miscalculate, and we would have civil war here in the United States, and you're apparently willing to engage in that risk. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not. So here's the question. What about the security agencies representing peaceful citizens when they have disagreements? And so, excuse me, let me start that again. Will the security agencies representing peaceful citizens have disagreements, and will some of them use force to try to impose their judgment?
The answer is no. And again, I've answered this question. I said if B and D, the security agencies, disagreed with each other, what they would have is a contract with each other to go to C or some other private court, and they would allow that court to determine their differences because they would be contractually obligated, and their legitimacy would depend upon adhering to contracts. And again, contracts are very important. Property rights and contracts are very important for all libertarians. And there is no contract between the government and the people. You call that implied contracts, but these implied contracts are not worth the paper they're not written on. Whereas here there would be explicit contracts, and these explicit contracts would, I think, suffice. Look, there's risk on both sides. To say that with government there's no risk and with anarchism there's a risk, I think that that's just a very erroneous way of looking at the matter. I think, you know, and I say, well, yeah, there's risks on the anarchist side, and you say, aha, you're willing to accept the risk. Well, there are risks on, you know, who guards the guardians. Many limited governments in history started out limited government and became non-limited governments and became totalitarian governments. Would the limited government people be willing to accept those risks? Yes, of course. So to just say that, okay, Walter, you think that there are risks, therefore your position is wrong, I think is a highly dubious way of arguing. Yes, there are risks in all cases, but you have to compare the risks, and I think when you compare the risks, you realize that governments are monstrous because they violate the non-aggression principle, whereas defense agencies do not start out violating the non-aggression principle. Whether they will or not, yes, it's a risk, but I think that there are good and sufficient reasons to believe that the risks are much less.
The difference being that when you have hundreds of defense agencies with a lot of military hardware, and you throw in to boot a lot of criminal gangs, there's going to be some people that resort to force, and the civil war is right here in the United States, in your neighborhood, as opposed to outside. When you have a monopoly of force with a strong government and military like the United States, nobody will attack you. You can live in peace, and if you have the right foreign policy, you don't have to worry about war. And so that's why I was asking you, why are you willing to accept those risks that when you have hundreds of agencies and you say none of them will initiate force, they're all angels, but when it comes to talk about the leaders of the United States, they're all devils. So that's a contradiction in your thinking, where you think all of a sudden these heads of these security agencies will never initiate force, will always act properly, when in fact the more there are, the more probable it is that they will go at each other at some point, at some time, and when they do, it's civil war right here in the United States. What do you think about that?
If this were true, then you should favor world government, because right now we have, what is it, 200 different countries? Now, I don't know how many defense agencies you think would be in the United States, but we right now have 250 or so countries, all armed. Even Liechtenstein or Belgium has got arms, and some of them fight each other. And the logical implication of the tenor of your question is, well, then we should have world government. You've never really responded to that question of whether you favor world government, but the logical, was that another interruption? I can't believe that.
It was a technical issue, Walter. You were frozen. I was just telling the moderator that you were frozen.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I misunderstood that. Sorry. What you're talking about is, oh, right now we have peace within the country, Let's forget about the drug wars, and let's forget about the cops killing people, and let's forget about the 40,000 people dying on the highways. We have relative peace. It's not as bad as Afghanistan or Syria. But the point is, this is an unfair comparison, because what you're doing is you're saying, here's a good government, the U.S., and here's a bad government, Afghanistan and Syria, and etc. And from that, you're deducing that somehow anarchism is the problem. I just don't understand that. It seems to me that you would have to come up with a case where there was anarchism. Now let's take the case of Somalia. There is a case where there is anarchism, where there are these tribal groups or these princes or whatever they call them, gangs, I don't know. And I'm surprised that you didn't use Somalia against me. Happily, Ben Powell and other people have done a lot of research about Somalia. And what they find is if you compare Somalia with the United States, Somalia doesn't look too good. But you're not holding ceteris paribus here. If you compare Somalia with the other African countries, Somalia starts looking pretty good. So I think you have to compare equals with equals, and you're not doing that. You're taking Afghanistan or Syria, which used to have very strong governments, and you're using them as a stick to beat up on the anarchist position, which I think is highly problematic.
Jen, you do have two more questions. A lot of the questions you maybe say are cause of clarification, but I did the same with Walter, because just in terms of time and length, I'm counting the amount of back and forths, and the amount of back and forths is what I'm counting. Because if you ask a question and then you ask the question again, I have to count that as two questions. Otherwise, we're just going to be here forever.
So apparently you think that these security agencies will never attack innocent people and initiate force against them, which in my view is that they are angels. Let me give you an example that might help you reconsider. The daughter of the boss of a security agency has a date with the son of the boss of another security agency. When she comes home, she tells her father that she has been raped. The father requests custody of the alleged rapist, who tells his father he did not rape her. The first security agency threatens to use force if the son is not turned over. The second security agency refuses. The first security agency attempts to capture the son by force but fails. The second security agency retaliates. The first security agency attempts to get help from other security agencies, and so on and so forth, until involving more and more people in this mini war and bringing in other security agencies on either side of a dispute. And this will be multiplied by thousands and hundreds of thousands of instances where the bosses of the country are now 100 or 200 or 1,000, or how many security agencies there are, because nobody has any control over them. They can do whatever they want to do with impunity, and nobody can do a thing because nobody else has any power. Whereas in our system, under a central government, one government, we can vote these politicians out, and we have a constitution, and we have a moral commitment, and we have a way of getting them out. But we have no way of getting out a rogue or just a difference of opinion dispute like the case I just recommended or just read about.
You know, you're putting words in my mouth when you say that I think that all defense agencies would be angels. They would never hurt anyone, any innocent person. I never said that. Let me turn your question around against you. You say the boy of one defense agency had a date with the girl of another. Suppose the boy was the son of the Chilean president, and the daughter was the daughter of the Argentinian president. And now the Argentinians, I forget who the son and who the daughter is, but whoever the son is, the other country is trying to get him, and they didn't get him. in other words, the analogy between that you're giving me with these two defense agencies, I could turn around and give you with the two countries. The logical implication of the two countries is we should have a world government, and the logical implication of the two groups is that we should have a single government. And yet you would accept the first one and you wouldn't accept the second one. So I see a bit of illogic in your position here. Because look, defense agencies are to the government as governments are to the world government. And anything you can say about two defense agencies, I can say about two countries. And I've already answered this question, well, 3 or 4 times, but what the heck, you ask it in different ways. I don't know how else to answer it, but this A, B, C, D, E sort of a question. Now look, what's going to happen if the Chilean and the Argentinian, or the Canadian and the American, or any two contiguous countries, say Spain and France, had this sort of an issue? What they would do is they'd go to a world court, or they would go to a private court, a private mediation agency. They're not going to have these fights that you keep fearing among defense agencies. So I reject the question. I think that it really, maybe I should accept the question because it really works out against your position, not against my position.
Jan, last question.
This is one more instance of mistaking a conclusion, or coming to the wrong conclusion based on comparing a country with a defense agency within another country, and a country with the world. The world is much bigger than any country, and it's quite different than one single country. And a difference in quantity becomes a difference in quality. So your equation doesn't make any sense, and it's the same reason why your other equation, that each person can become a government in himself, doesn't make any sense either. It's the same fallacy of ignoring the quantity involved. Now, I've been trying to get answers to questions, and instead I've been getting speeches about a lot of other things, and that's why when I sent you the debate format rules, I said 30 minutes for a question and 1 minute for an answer, and I wanted to avoid this, which is a lot of lectures on issues that are irrelevant to the question and leaving the question in the dust to talk about something else. But anyway, I endured it. So I got a question here, which is, under anarchism, would a citizen ever be forced to follow a law he disagreed with?
Yes. Under anarchism, despite your claim that there'd be different laws for each one, that would be the view of David Friedman. Murray Rothbard has, I think, a much better view of anarchism, and this would be constructivist in the sense that Hayek rejected constructivism, and Murray Rothbard's constructivism is the non-aggression principle. Yes, if a criminal, a rapist, a murderer didn't like the non-aggression principle, he would be forced to adhere to it in any case, and so would a bandit court or a criminal gang. So the answer to your question is, your question was, would anyone be forced to adhere to a law he didn't agree with? Yes. There would only be one law, the non-aggression principle, and the implications of it based on private property. And the criminal types who didn't like the non-aggression principle would be forced to adhere to it, because if they didn't, they would be punished.
He couldn't say, I secede, and therefore you have no jurisdiction over me? Because that's what you were saying before, that everybody should have the right to secede. They raise their hand and say, oh, I seceded last week, so this is not applicable to me.
Well, that's an extra question. I think that,
okay.
But what the heck, it's a good question, and it's a question that's been asked many a time. Yeah, they could say I secede and therefore leave me alone, in effect, but then we would invade their country. Their country of, say, Jones. Pete Jones is a rapist and he just seceded. We would enter his country and put him in jail. Okay.
Now a rebuttal. You have 3 minutes rebuttal, Walter.
Well, I think I get extra time, don't I? Because he asked for extra 2 minutes twice, and I only asked for extra 2 minutes once.
Sure.
Isn't that right?
Twice.
Right?
I thought.
Okay. My rebuttal, I think that both of us had the same experience. We each asked each other questions, and neither of us was satisfied with the answers that the other guy gave, which I think is reasonable because we don't agree with each other. I asked questions about implied consent, or I asked him if I claimed that he owed me $1,000, he'd want some proof, and now I claim he's a citizen of the United States, and he resorts to implied consent. I think implied consent is very silly. In this context, I think that there's no consent at all, and then the government has got a lot of chutzpah, a lot of nerve, claiming that that anything has been delegated to these rascals. Nothing has been delegated to them. I don't care how many public opinion surveys you take. Nobody delegated anything. If you think that, why doesn't the government send out the Constitution and say who agrees with that? And there have been cases where they've done that, and people rejected it on the ground that was communist propaganda or whatever. Now, I'm also unsatisfied with Jan's view about secession. He says, well, you can secede, but only, I don't know whether it be a state or a city or a neighborhood, but not the individual. Well, suppose we got it down to 10 individuals, and they were a country, and now one of them wanted to leave, and there are only 9, and now there are 8. I don't see this idea of how many numbers there are. It's a matter of principle. Either you have free association or you don't have free association, and if the individual can't secede, well, the individual can't secede from the rapist, or the slave can't secede, and secession is very crucially important. He never answered the question of anarchy between countries. It seems to me that if you're a statist, and he is a statist, a limited statist, but a statist, he believes in government, well, then he has to believe in world government, and he never touched upon that issue. Maybe it's a matter of numbers, but I don't think so, because there are 265 or 270 countries, and I don't think that there'd be more than 270 defense agencies in the country. So I don't think that Jan can hide behind numbers. So I reiterate my opening statements on deontology, or as a matter of rights. The government per se necessarily violates the non-aggression principle, and it ought to be punished for it. Should they do it? What should we do? Is a moral question, and I'm not that interested in moral questions. I don't think, like the Randians do, that everything is connected to everything. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an economist. I'm a libertarian, and for me, libertarianism is just concerned with the non-aggression principle. So I think secession should be down to the individual level. I think that the government necessarily violates the non-aggression principle. And Jan, I think, is upholding anarchy between countries. In his concluding remarks, I wish he would face that issue. Now, with regard to so much for the deontology. Now for the utilitarianism. Jan keeps making the point that isn't it possible, given that nobody is an angel, isn't it possible that we're going to have fights between different people? In this case of the rapist, the boy from one group rapes or is accused of raping the girl from another, and he denies it, and now what? Yes, there'll be difficulties, but these things will tend to be solved because of the legitimacy questions. Namely, if both of these defense agencies, the boy and the girl, are legitimate defense agencies, they will have a contract with each other, and they will mediate this. They will go to a third-party mediator, and that'll settle it. Whereas with the government is just based on force. And another point that Jan makes is, isn't there a risk? Well, yes, there's a risk. There's a risk of everything. You get out of bed, it's a risk. You go into bed, it's a risk. Everything's a risk. Just saying something is a risk, it doesn't suffice to make the case for the limited government case. Because there are risks on the other side. Suppose you have this monopoly and it goes berserk, as in the case of I don't know, Afghanistan or Hitler or Stalin or any of these other places. Jan is forever talking about the U.S., but why not talk about the Soviet Union? Under communism, under Stalin or Lenin, under Nazism, you had very, very strong governments. And you didn't have any anarchy there. So one wonders, how come Hitler killed, I don't know, 6 or 11 million people? How come Mao killed 60 million? And how come the communists killed 20 million? If they had not Jan's ideal state, because these were not limited governments, obviously, but they were strong governments. And if I hear how great strong governments are anymore, I think I'm going to cough up or something, because strong governments are no guarantee. There's a risk also with strong governments. Look, as far as I'm concerned, Obama possibly, conceivably, could say, well, I'm not giving up after 2016 because, let's say Rand Paul won the election, and he says, I'm staying in, and he has a coup d'etat. You can have coup d'etats with strong governments. So strong governments are no guarantee of safety, and he keeps talking about, well, there'd be many, many different defense agencies, and there'd be a spark, and there'd be a fight. Well, there's a risk, but there's also a risk the other way around, which Jan averts his eyes from, and I think that that's very, very foolish. But let me end on a positive note. Again, as I started out, I'm a great admirer of Jan, and I thought that his interview of Nancy Pelosi was just magnificent, and everybody should watch that. You'll enjoy it greatly. And I think that Jan is a libertarian, even though he's a limited government libertarian. I regard Jan as a brother or a fellow libertarian. We do have our disputes over this, and those will have to continue. And I'm sure Jan will agree with me that what we ought to do is knock down the government to 5 or 10% of whatever it is now, namely to Ayn Rand's view of government protecting rights and having armies to keep foreign bad guys off us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and courts to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are. And once we get to that, then we can have a real good debate as to whether we should go further and get rid of this monopoly. I would say also that if people who are statists would read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, this would greatly benefit them. Because the message I get from Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is that competition brings about a better product. And monopoly is an evil. Monopoly doesn't satisfy customers, because if you have a monopoly, the customers can't go anywhere else. Jan says, okay, yes, you can go off into the woods, but the government isn't going to accept that. The government is going to allow you to go off in the woods and not pay taxes if you're in the domestic United States. And even if you leave, the government still wants, the U.S. government still wants you to pay taxes. So it's been very enjoyable, and I now turn the microphone over to Jan.
Hi. I think the crux of the matter here is your understanding of the non-aggression principle, what I call the you should not initiate physical force. Many libertarians see that as an irreducible primary, as a starting point in ethics, that if you do it, you're doing something wrong if you violate it. And in fact, it's not a starting point, it's not an axiom, it's a means to an end. It is a means to protecting the judgment and bodily integrity of the citizens, the human beings, and those are a means to a different end, which is the ultimate end, which is to have a long, happy life. That should be your ultimate end, and you should judge the principle of non-initiation of physical force in reference to whether it realizes the ultimate end. That's its purpose. It's not a commandment from God, and that is why Mr. Block had difficulty with the question that I asked, would he ever violate that principle, because he sees it like a commandment of God, and if he does violate it, he thinks he's doing something wrong. But in fact, by bringing this up, I may be saving his life, because he will think about it, and he will know that it will be morally correct for him to steal the water and stay alive, because we need him for the next debate. So anyway, that's what is missing here, is the context of the principle of non-aggression, and not understanding that it is not an irreducible primary, but simply a means to an end. Now, the other part of the context is that this principle was implemented on the context, on the foundation that you had a government and that its purpose is to protect the individual rights of the citizens, and that when it charges you money to provide that service that you need and want, it's a good thing. It's not initiating physical force. If you try to use this principle of the non-initiation of physical force to apply to a different context, like extreme duress, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in terms of what? In terms of achieving the ultimate end. And if you haven't integrated your ethics, you cannot integrate your politics, because ultimately all political issues are reduced to whether it is good, whether this political system is good, and good is an ethical concept. And I tell you very clearly what my ultimate end is, and so you would know that if permitting everybody to not pay taxes and violate any law that they didn't agree with would lead to the unraveling of the state, the limited government that I believe in, reluctantly, I would have to, for a brief period, not count on their consent, but permit them to transition into another situation where nobody is abusing them. But apparently the anarchists don't want to do that. They don't want to go to a territory where they can experiment with their own political system. They think that they can get everybody to change their mind on what is required for the optimum protection of our individual rights. And good luck, it's not going to happen. At best, if you could get this offer that I'm suggesting, you would be in good hands. Now, with regards to the world government, it was a very bad idea, and the analogy doesn't hold, because it's quite different, a world government, than a nation, and a security agency is different than a country. And so this analogy doesn't hold at all, so that's why I'm against it. Now, in this debate, I've been able to bring up the risk of gang warfare. Not just risk, it's that they will necessarily happen, because people will have millions of disputes, and you just need a small percentage of them to go haywire, to where they decide to resort to force. This father of this son is not going to give up his son to the other guy's prison, no matter what. I can assure you, he's not going to send his son 10 years in jail if he thinks it's true that his son did not rape this girl. So apparently you don't know how people operate. And all these heads of these security agencies would be like the barons, the dukes of the United States, because they would be above the law. Nobody could say anything to them or prevent them from any atrocity, because nobody would have the force to put them in line, and there would be no procedure to get them out, because they are the last word, because they have military hardware to enforce whatever rule they decide. So in order to avoid gang warfare, on the basis of all these disputes, you need to have all military power, major military power, in one entity. So it's impossible for them to go to war with themselves. And you can live in peace if you have a good foreign policy. But if you have a bad foreign policy, like we do, you suffer other consequences. But you don't have to have a bad foreign policy. You can have a very good foreign policy. So, do I have a little bit of time here or not?
I mean, pretty much done.
Okay.
Okay. So Walter, you have 1 minute to refute some of his claims. Lenny has 1 minute to refute yours, and then we'll just do closing remarks. So there were a lot there, but I guess you can pick.
Leave that up. That was the rebuttal.
Well, Jan rejects the world government argument as a disanalogy, but I don't see the disanalogy. If he sees dukes and royal people, earls and dukes and marquises as the final word, well, then the sovereign nations have the final word. I don't see any difference between the boy who rapes the girl, and there are two defense agencies. Well, I do see a difference. And the boy who rapes the girl, and they're from two different countries. The difference I see is that the defense agencies would be obligated, contractually obligated, and if they didn't adhere to their obligation to outsource it to a third party, they would then be considered a bandit court, and they would disappear. As Henry Hazlitt tells us, and as all of economics tells us, with one single word, competition brings about a better product, and it brings about a better product not only with pens and wristwatches and shirts, but with defense agencies as well. So I don't see Jan's point there. Jan typically misunderstands or misconstrues the views that I'm holding. He thinks that I think that all these people would be angels. They wouldn't be angels, but they would be operating under a different milieu. They'd be operating under a legal milieu. They'd be operating under a system that was not a per se violation of rights at the get-go, at the outset. Whereas his system, it starts with a very bad premise. The basic premise of government is force and violence and violation of rights. Look, just because I was a little unsure as to whether I would grab water or not, that's a very different kind of question from the question of anarchism or limited government issues. And I don't think that you have to integrate everything. I think that you can discuss politics in and of itself. I don't think you have to get into morality. Morality is certainly a different issue. So I disagree with Jan on that point as well. He continually uses examples of strong governments like the United States, but he ignores strong governments like the Soviet Union was a strong government until it fell apart. China is a strong government. There are lots of strong governments that are evil, and somehow these strong governments we forget all about, and we just look at, I don't know, the United States, which internally is a lot better than some of these other cases. I don't understand this business of secession. If one person, if Louisiana has a right to secede from the United States, and Jan would agree, and New Orleans has a right to secede from Louisiana, and I don't know, they don't have counties here, they have parishes. If the Orleans parish secedes from Louisiana or from the city of New Orleans, that's okay, and all of a sudden it doesn't become okay. I don't understand why secession, which means upholding the law of free association, works in some cases and not in other cases. I think that that's inconsistent. But the major inconsistency, the major problem I have with Jan's view, let me read this quote from Schumpeter again. The theory which construes taxes on the analogy of club dues only proves how far removed this part of social science is from scientific habits of mind. Jan does not have a scientific habit of mind in this one question. I think he has a scientific habit of mind in many other issues, but on this one issue, he doesn't have a scientific habit of mind. He thinks that somehow a group calling itself the United States has the right to impose itself on other people, to violate the non-aggression principle, and just because under duress there are questions as to whether under these emergency situations whether you should do something or shouldn't do something, has got nothing to do with the fact that there's no emergency situation going on. and yet the government is violating the non-aggression principle. Now, Jan says that he would give us anarchists, I don't know, someplace in the wilds of Montana or Alaska. Well, he's very decent, and I would give him, I would return the same favor. He can have statism wherever he wants. He can have, I talk about murder court somewhere where people are allowed to shoot each other, where they agree to do it. If he wants to have his state somewhere, I'm willing to, on his private property. Look, they can even have voluntary slavery if people are willing to do it, whatever it is between consenting adults. But I think Jan's vision of libertarianism is very different than mine. Despite the fact that there are questions about emergency situations, he just violates the non-aggression principle with his support of government, because government is per se a violator of the non-aggression principle. They tax us. They say that we can't have competition for them. Look, suppose the Jones family, as Hans Hoppe would say, the Jones family said, look, we're setting up a government, and if you don't like it here, you have to leave. And I don't know. It seems to me that the Jones government is as good as any other government, unless you want to have democracy. And I'm not a big fan of democracy because numbers don't make right. Might doesn't make right, and numbers don't make right. If before I told Jan that he owes me $1,000 just as an example. Well, suppose I got a whole majority of the country to agree that Jan owes me $100 or $1,000, which is totally false. He doesn't owe me a penny. Democracy doesn't make anything that's wrong right. So I don't see any difference between the Joneses, some upstart criminals who say that we all have to pay allegiance to them, and the present government, which is based on democracy. In both cases, it's a violation of the non-aggression principle, and I think that the essence of libertarianism is to adhere to the non-aggression principle, and if you break it, as in the case of grabbing someone's water or engaging in this libertarian concentration camp guard situation, well, then you have to pay a penalty.
All right. Jan.
My summary?
Yeah.
First point here is an interesting one. If you are right and anarchism is the optimum way to protect my individual rights, then it is true that, how come I'm gone from the picture?
I see you.
Then it is true that I'm doing something morally wrong because I am affecting myself, my ultimate value, which is the possibility of a happy life. But if, on the other hand, I am right and anarchism makes it much less possible to have my rights protected, then in that case, you're doing something morally wrong because you are trying to harm yourself and everybody else and impose anarchism on them and ruin their life. So that's why it's important to go through the consequences of anarchism and figure out where you have a better protection of your individual rights, your right to life, liberty, and property. And that's why I went through the criminals that are incentivized, the foreign tyrants that are incentivized to commit crimes and attack and expropriate wealth from less powerful people in the United States, and the inevitable conclusion that with so many disputes, even amongst good, rational people, some of these disputes, the people will resort to force. They won't all go for arbitration. And when you have that conflict between two agencies, two defense agencies, the consequence is civil war, gang warfare, which makes life here in the United States miserable and impossible. And that's what nobody has shown me is not true. And that's why I think I'm doing the right thing by defending limited government. Now, a very important point is that apparently you don't see the relationship between ethics and politics and political theory. And you could see it right in the debate proposition. When you say no government is better than limited government, better is an ethical, moral, valued concept. It's good. It's better than the other. So ultimately, you have to validate your political theory against an ultimate end, which I have told you is a long, happy life. My life is my ultimate end. If you knew that, you would know when not to apply the principle. You would steal the water and save your life because you would see that the principle is leading to your destruction. But since you don't know what the purpose of the principle is, you see it as a commandment from God or as an irreducible primary, a starting point in ethics. Let's start here. This makes sense, and not know where it came from. You don't apply it correctly. You apply it in.
Looks like you froze. Jan, you froze. Walter, you're seeing that also?
Yeah. No, now he's back.
You're back. Sorry, you froze a little.
You're applying it to a context which is pre-government, where there is no government. We already have a government. We needed a government to protect our individual rights. And then you want to apply that non-aggression principle to a context which doesn't apply, because the real context in which this principle was formed within the context that there is a government, and what kind of government it should be, and I'm advocating it should be a limited government. That's the context, and the principle works very well under normal circumstances, except for duress, but it doesn't work to apply to contexts which are not where it was created, how this principle was created, and for what purpose. So I suggest that you examine your ethics and integrate them into your politics. So the political systems that you advocate lead to your ultimate value. So in any debate, you should say up front what your ultimate value is and how this political system leads to that ultimate value. And in this case, this is just a minor intermediate principle. The more important principle is the values that are being protected, which are everybody having the right to follow their own judgment, and when you use force, you prevent them from doing that, and everybody having their bodily integrity. When you use force, you can harm their bodily integrity, and those values are in turn a means to a different, higher value, which is your life, your possibility of having a happy life. That is what the kind of homework that you and the viewers should do, so that you apply that principle correctly, because right now you're applying it as a commandment from God, and you get a result that is counterproductive, because ultimately you're harming yourself. If you're wrong that this anarchism will in fact create havoc, civil war, gang warfare, incentivize criminality, and make gangs go for military hardware. If you're wrong about that, and they will do that, then you're harming yourself. So I suggest that you examine it and see, and also that you realize that all political discussions ultimately have to be justified on a conclusion about your ethics, and specifically on what is your ultimate value.
Daniel, Jan got an extra 2 minutes twice. I only got it once, so can I get my extra 2 minutes now?
Wait a second. This is my summary. That's it. We're finished.
Dan.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Jan got extra 2 minutes twice. I only got it once.
You could have taken it before, Walter, but you can't take it out of turn, and you can't talk last because I get the last word.
Jan, I'm not asking you. I'm asking Dan, the moderator.
Yeah, well, check out and see who talked more, and you'll see that you talk a lot more than I did, so don't worry about that. As far as you wanted equal time, you used a structure that I knew would get out of hand, and it did, and I tolerated it. But now the debate's over because...
Meanwhile, I'm asking Dan a question, and you won't let him answer.
Go ahead.
Well, I want to be fair to both of you. He did take time, so if it's quick, and it's not a problem for Jan if it's just a minute or so.
No, this is the summary, and he can't get the last word and have the first word. And he had an opportunity to take extra time. And if you look at the times and anybody calculates them, you'll see he talked at least as much as I did. So,
what's your ruling, Daniel?
Well, I'm looking at the debate, and certainly we haven't followed the time structure. So,
that's
and
right.
I'm not sure you guys had an equal amount of questions, but it says at the end there's an affirmative, and then there's a negative, which is the rebuttal. Then there's a reply to the rebuttal, and then there's a summary. So I'm not sure we really did the summary. I think we did the reply.
We
so
did the summary already. We already did the rebuttal just before the summary. And you included an extra section in there that wasn't in the debate rules. But
well, I mean, look, hold on a second.
We just did the summary, and that's it. So
I'm asking Dan for a ruling. Notice I'm willing to arbitrate. Jan, will you let him speak so he can give his...
Look, here's what Jan sent me, if you could see it in the thing. So we had an affirmative, if you see it on the right-hand side. Then we had a negative. Then we had a reply. Then we had a further affirmative. Then we had a reply to the negative. So we didn't really have a summary. So I'm willing to give Walter a summary.
That's what it is. That is the summary. What do you mean? It says it's right there, the summary.
Jan, not only do you interrupt me, but you interrupt him. Why don't you let him finish?
I'm saying there's a rebuttal. Then there's a reply to the rebuttal. We did that. Then there's a summary, which is...
He did that.
We didn't do that.
He did a summary, and now he wants extra 2 minutes at the end of the debate.
And I'm waiting for Daniel's ruling on that. Jan, why don't you let him give his ruling?
Fine. My ruling is this, and which I want to be fair, is to give Walter 2 minutes, and then at the end give Jan another 2 minutes, because we didn't really have a summary. We combined them, and I think that's fair, because Walter is asking for 2 minutes. He didn't really get to ask 12 questions, but I also, I want to give you the closing remark because he got the opening remark. So I'm willing to give him 2 minutes and give you both 2 minutes. How does that sound?
Well, I disagree. I think that we had the summary, and I've had the debate, and we can do another debate another time, but we should follow the rules. He had a summary. I had my summary. And I think if he looks at it, he'll see that he had as much time as I did by far.
Well, since the ruling has been that I can speak for 2 minutes and then Jan can speak for 2 minutes, I'm now going to speak for 2 minutes.
I disagree.
I think that's a fair rule.
I notice you disagree. I notice you keep interrupting. You're a lawless